Studies from DNA paternity labs suggest that roughly 1 in 10 men who take a paternity test discover they've been raising a child that isn't biologically theirs. 1 in 10. Think about that for a second. That means right now, somewhere in your city, there is a man paying child support, showing up to school plays, teaching a kid to drive, and he has no idea. None. And somewhere, there is a woman who knows, who has always known, and has said nothing. I know this story because I lived it, because I am the child at the center of it, and because on the day I was supposed to be the happiest I had ever been in my life, an older man stood up in a room full of 120 people, reached for a microphone, and said the words that split my entire world in two: before and after. My name is Allie. I am 30 years old, and this is the truest thing I have ever told anyone. It was a Saturday in October, the kind of October day that feels like the whole year has been building toward it. The air cool and clean, the trees just starting to turn, the light coming through the venue windows in long gold strips that hit the dance floor like something out of a movie. We had spent 11 months planning this wedding. Every napkin fold, every centerpiece, every song in the DJ's set list. Daniel, my fiancé, my husband as of that afternoon, had cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. His shoulders shook. His best man patted him on the back. I held it together right up until I didn't, which was somewhere around the second vow. The reception was everything we had imagined. The hall was full, the food was good, people were dancing. My college roommate was already on her third glass of wine and had kicked off her heels. For about 2 hours, it was perfect. Then, the best man handed the microphone to my dad. That's what we called it, the open mic portion of the evening. Friends and family could stand up, say a few words, share a memory. We had done it at the rehearsal dinner the night before, and it had been warm and funny, and nobody cried too hard. So when Victor stood up, I smiled at him from across the room. He was wearing a navy suit he had clearly bought for the occasion. His hair was combed. He was holding a note card. I thought, this is going to be sweet. My dad giving a toast at my wedding. I had imagined this moment since I was a little girl. He tapped the microphone once. The room settled. He looked at his note card, then set it down on the table. He looked at me. And then he started talking. And the room that had been warm and loud and full of laughter went so quiet I could hear the candles flickering. I want to pause right here, right at this exact moment. Because what Victor said next is the kind of thing you cannot unhear. The kind of thing that, once it is out in the air, changes the shape of everything around it. But to understand why he said it, and what it cost him, I have to take you back. All the way back. To a Tuesday morning when I was 3 years old, and my parents signed their divorce papers at a courthouse in downtown. I wasn't there, obviously. I don't remember any of it. What I remember is the life that came after. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you have ever had a moment where the floor shifted under your feet and nothing looked the same afterward, type, "I know that feeling," in the comments right now. And stay with me, because this gets deeper before it gets better. I'm going to tell you something I never told anyone until I was an adult. When I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my mother's voice. She was in the kitchen. The light under my door was on. She was on the phone. This was back when people still had landlines. And her voice was low and tight, the way it got when she was upset, but didn't want me to know she was upset. I lay there, half asleep, listening. I couldn't make out most of the words, but I heard one sentence clearly. She said, "He will never find out. I promise you." Then silence. Then she hung up. The kitchen light went off. I fell back asleep. In the morning, I convinced myself I had dreamed it. I was a kid. Kids hear things wrong. Kids imagine things. My mother was fine at breakfast. Normal, a little rushed, same as every Tuesday. She poured my cereal and reminded me to bring my permission slip to school and asked if I wanted braids or a ponytail. I said ponytail. And I forgot about the phone call for 22 years. My childhood, from the outside, looked completely ordinary. My parents had divorced when I was 3. My mother, Sandra, raised me in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. She worked in hospital billing. Long hours, a lot of paperwork, home by 6 most nights. She was a capable woman, organized. She kept the apartment clean and the fridge stocked and made sure I got to school on time every day. She wasn't the kind of mother who sat on the floor and played with you, but she was there. That counted for something. My dad, Victor, lived about 15 minutes away. He was a civil engineer, the kind of job that sounds boring until you realize it means he spent his days designing the infrastructure that held the city together. Bridges, drainage systems, road foundations. Quiet, essential, invisible work. That was Victor in a sentence. He paid child support every month without being asked twice. My mother told me this when I was older, almost like she was surprised by it herself. "Most guys have to be chased down," she said. "He just paid. On time. Every month. For years." He came every weekend. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, his gray Toyota in the driveway. He never missed. I could set a clock by him. He would take me to the park, or to the library, or to the diner on 5th Street where they had the best blueberry pancakes in the city, and the waitress knew his order by heart. Sometimes we just drove around and listened to the radio and talked about nothing in particular. He was easy to be around. He never raised his voice. He never made me feel like a burden or an obligation. He taught me to ride a bike in the parking lot of an empty church on a Sunday afternoon when I was 6. I remember the exact moment he let go of the back of the seat, and I didn't know he had let go, and I just kept pedaling. I must have gone 30 feet before I realized he wasn't holding on anymore. I turned around to look at him, and he was standing 20 feet behind me with his hands in the air like he'd just scored a touchdown. "That's my girl," he said. "That's my girl." I fell off the bike immediately after that because I was looking at him instead of where I was going. He ran over, checked my knee, and laughed. Not at me, but in that relieved, joyful way that parents laugh when their kid is okay after a scare. That is the man I am talking about. But here is the thing I noticed as I got older. The thing that sat at the back of my mind like a splinter you can feel but can't quite reach. Every time Victor pulled up to our apartment, my mother's energy changed. Not dramatically, not in a way she would have admitted to if you asked her, but I noticed. Her shoulders came up half an inch. Her jaw set. She would glance out the window when she heard his car and then look away too quickly, like she didn't want to be caught looking. She always had somewhere she needed to be, always hurried the handoff. A quick, "Hey, how are you?" at the door, and then she was busy. She had errands. She would see us at 5. He never pushed back. He was always polite. But it was the kind of politeness that has a wall behind it. And she never, not once, not a single time in my entire childhood, let me spend the night at his place. Other kids with divorced parents had sleepovers at their dad's apartment all the time. I asked about it once, when I was 9. My mother said Victor's place was too small, and he didn't have the right setup for a kid to sleep over comfortably. When I asked Victor, he got quiet for a second, and then said he was working on it, that he was going to get a bigger place soon. He never did. Or if he did, my mother never allowed the sleepover. I let it go, the way kids let things go when the adult world is too complicated to push on. I had my weekends with him. I had my blueberry pancakes. I had the man in the parking lot with his hands in the air. I thought that was enough. I didn't know yet what it was costing him. I didn't know yet what it was hiding. Here is a number: 240. That is how many monthly child support payments Victor made between the time I was 3 years old and the time I turned 23 and the legal obligation ended. 240 checks. 240 times he sat down, wrote the amount, signed his name, and sent the money without being chased, without being reminded, without complaining to anyone who would have listened. The neighbors on his street knew him as the responsible divorced dad. The guy who never skipped a payment, never made excuses, never dragged his ex to court over a few dollars. People respected that. His coworkers respected that. His mother, my grandmother, though we were never as close as I wish we had been, would tell anyone who'd listen that her son was a man of his word. He was 31 when the divorce happened. He never remarried. He dated, a little, here and there over the years, a woman he met through work when he was in his late 30s, another he knew from his church when he was in his 40s. Nothing stuck. Nothing lasted more than a year. His friends told him he was too focused on work, too quiet, too set in his ways. He nodded and changed the subject. But I think, and I think this more now than I ever did before, that the real reason nothing stuck was simpler than any of that. He had already built his life around one thing. He had a daughter. He was her father. And everything else, every potential new relationship, every chance at something bigger, came second to that identity. He was Victor, Allie's dad. That was who he was. The warning signs came slowly, the way warning signs usually do. The first one I know about happened when I was around 11. Victor came in for a routine physical, the kind where they check your blood pressure and run basic labs and make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. The doctor, going through his chart, cross-referenced a few things and paused. He asked Victor about family medical history. Then he asked about his daughter's blood type. Victor told him. The doctor frowned, just slightly, just for a second, and said something like, that's a little unusual. Not impossible, but worth noting. Victor asked what he meant. The doctor was careful, diplomatic. He said blood type inheritance could sometimes throw surprises, and it probably meant nothing. Victor went home, thought about it for a few days, and then called Sandra. He kept his voice neutral, he told me later. He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was just asking, just checking. Did she know anything about this? Was there something in her family's medical history that would explain the mismatch? Sandra's response was immediate and dismissive. She said the doctor was being overly cautious, that blood type genetics were more complicated than most people realized, that these kinds of mismatches happened all the time and didn't mean anything. She said it with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the answer. And maybe she had. Victor said, okay. He let it go. He wanted to let it go. There is a difference between not knowing something and not wanting to know it. Victor was a smart man. He was methodical. He spent his career calculating tolerances and stress loads and failure points. He knew how to follow a line of reasoning to its conclusion. But this was not a bridge. This was his daughter. And so he chose, consciously or not, to accept the explanation and move on. I wonder sometimes what those years were like inside his head, whether the question ever resurfaced at 3 in the morning, whether he ever sat in his car outside our apartment on a Saturday morning, watching the window, and let himself wonder, really wonder, before pushing it back down and going to knock on the door. I will never know for certain. He is not the kind of man who talks about the things that scare him. What I know is that he kept paying, kept showing up, kept sitting in the front row. When I made the varsity swim team junior year of high school, he drove 45 minutes each way to every home meet and stood at the edge of the pool in his work clothes because he came straight from the office and never had time to change. He had a towel ready when I got out of the water. He always had a towel. 20 years, 240 payments. A life built on a foundation of love, and underneath it, without his knowledge, a lie. Daniel proposed to me on a Thursday evening in February, in the kitchen of the apartment we had been sharing for 2 years, with a ring he had been hiding in a box of cornstarch in the back of the pantry for 6 weeks, because he said it was the one place he was absolutely certain I would never look. He was not wrong. I have never once voluntarily touched a box of cornstarch. We set the wedding date for the following October. 11 months to plan. We were both the kind of people who make spreadsheets for things like this, which means we were also the kind of people who made each other slightly insane on a regular basis, but in a way that fundamentally worked. Daniel is thoughtful. Genuinely, sometimes annoyingly thoughtful. He is the person who remembers the name of your coworker's dog and asks about it 3 months later. He is the person who mails thank you notes by hand. So when he started talking about 4 months before the wedding about putting together a family history project as a gift for both of our families, it did not surprise me in the slightest. He had seen the DNA ancestry kits everywhere. Television commercials, social media ads, gift guides. The idea was simple. Everyone in both families would take the test, and Daniel would compile the results into a custom family history book. Birth records, migration patterns, ethnicity breakdowns, the whole thing. He was going to have it printed and bound and give copies to both sets of parents at the rehearsal dinner. It was a genuinely lovely idea. I told him so. He ordered the kits, mailed them out with handwritten notes explaining the project and asking people to send the results directly to him. My mother sent hers back quickly. A few of his relatives took longer. And then he called Victor. Victor, by his own account, was skeptical at first. He was not a sentimental man by nature, and the idea of spitting into a tube and mailing it to a company in California struck him as mildly absurd. Daniel was persistent, the way Daniel is persistent about things he believes in. Warm, patient, never pushy, just genuinely enthusiastic in a way that is hard to say no to. He called Victor twice, and by the second call, Victor had agreed. 6 weeks later, the results came in. Daniel received the email notification and started going through the results to compile the family history file. He pulled up Victor's results, cross-referenced them against mine. The software flagged the comparison automatically, a feature of the platform designed to identify family connections among participants. The flag read, "No significant shared DNA detected. Relationship? Unrelated." Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he read it again. Then he called the company's customer support line to ask whether there could be a processing error. The representative walked him through it carefully. The results were accurate. The samples had been processed twice, as per standard protocol. There was no error. Daniel did not call me. He did not call Sandra. He drove directly to Victor's house, a 40-minute drive, and sat across from him at the kitchen table, and showed him the results on a laptop screen. Victor looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Then, he asked Daniel to leave the laptop with him and come back in an hour. Daniel drove to a gas station down the road and sat in the parking lot for 63 minutes. He told me later he spent most of that time staring at the steering wheel and trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. When he came back, Victor was sitting in the same chair at the kitchen table. The laptop was closed. His hands were flat on the table. His face was the kind of calm that is actually the opposite of calm. The stillness you hold on to when everything underneath is moving. He told Daniel 2 things. The first was that he appreciated him coming in person. The second was that he needed Daniel not to tell Allie. Not yet. Not until he had figured out what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. Daniel, to his credit, and also to his eternal frustration because he is constitutionally incapable of keeping important things from me, agreed. That was 14 days before our wedding. 0.0% probability of paternity. 20 years. And now, a countdown. I want you to think about something. Try to actually put yourself in it. You have just learned that the child you have loved for 20 years, the child you built your entire adult life around, the child you showed up for every single week without exception, the child whose first steps you watched and whose swim meets you attended in your work clothes because you didn't have time to change. That child is not biologically yours. You have known this for 72 hours. The wedding is in 2 weeks. She is happy. She is the happiest you have ever seen her. There are flowers being arranged, and a dress hanging in a garment bag, and a man who loves her, who is currently keeping your secret at your request. What do you do? This is the question Victor sat with for 14 days. And I only know what those 14 days looked like because he told me afterward, in pieces, over the course of several months. It was not one long conversation. It was more like a slow unpacking, something he would mention over coffee or in the car, or sometimes in a single text message sent late at night that I wouldn't read until morning. The first few days, he said, he barely slept. He would lie down and the math would start cycling. 20 years, 240 payments, a kitchen table, a laptop screen, 0.0%. He would get up and make coffee and sit in the dark and let it run. He was not angry. That surprised me when he told me. I expected him to describe rage, the kind of fury that makes sense when you find out you've been deceived on this scale. But he said anger wasn't the right word. What he felt was more like vertigo. Like the ground had shifted, and he was still figuring out which direction was up. He thought about Sandra. He thought about a lot of things involving Sandra, things he had noticed and chosen not to pursue over the years. Small inconsistencies, moments of avoidance. The night she got a phone call and took it in the bedroom and came out 15 minutes later and said it was nothing. He thought about the doctor and the blood type and the explanation she had given him so quickly and so confidently. He thought about me. He went through every memory he had of me, he said, like a man checking receipts. Not looking for proof of the lie. He already had proof. He was looking for something else. He was checking whether the love held up under the weight of what he now knew. It did. That was the thing. Every single memory, the church parking lot, the blueberry pancakes, the swim meets, the graduation, every one of them was still real, still warm, still his. The DNA result had not reached back through 20 years and made any of it less true. He had loved me. He still loved me. That had not changed. But he had also been deceived, and someone was responsible for that. And that person would be sitting 10 feet away from him at a wedding reception in 14 days, watching her daughter get married and smiling like none of it had ever happened. He decided in those first few days that he was not going to say anything. He was going to go to the wedding, sit in his seat, give a normal toast, shake Daniel's hand, dance with me once if the DJ played something slow enough, and take this to his grave. That was the plan. He changed his mind on day 11. He told me he was driving home from work. A Tuesday, ordinary, traffic on the highway, radio on, when something shifted. He said it was not a dramatic moment. There was no sign from the universe, no sudden clarity. He just found himself thinking about what it would mean to keep this secret for the rest of his life. Not just for himself, but for me. I was about to start a marriage. I was about to build a family of my own. And somewhere in the city, there was a man who was my biological father who had no idea I existed. And somewhere in the years ahead, there might be a moment, a medical form, a genetic question, a conversation with my own child, where the truth mattered in a way that silence could not protect me from. He thought about what my mother had said to someone on the phone 22 years ago. He will never find out, I promise you. Victor pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a while. Then, he called Daniel. He said 3 words. I'm going to speak. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. Then he asked if Victor needed anything. Victor said no. He said he had known what he wanted to say for 11 days. He just hadn't been sure he was brave enough to say it. Now he was sure. 3 days later, he bought a navy suit. The first suit he had bought in 12 years. And on a Saturday in October, with gold light coming through the venue windows and 120 people holding champagne glasses, he stood up and reached for the microphone. Here is what 120 people look like when they go quiet all at once. 1 second, the room is full. Glasses clinking, someone laughing at the far end of the bar, the low hum of 30 conversations overlapping. And then a man taps a microphone twice, and the sound drops out like a power failure. Not instantly, in waves. Table by table, conversation by conversation, until the only sound left is the faint buzz of the speaker and the distant clatter of a busboy in the kitchen who hasn't gotten the memo yet. That is what I remember first, the silence. How fast it arrived and how complete it was. Victor stood at the front of the room near the small podium the DJ had set up for toasts. He was holding the microphone with both hands, the way someone holds something they are afraid of dropping. His navy suit was pressed. His silver hair was combed. He had a note card on the table in front of him that he had looked at once and then set down and never looked at again. He said, I've been trying to figure out for 2 weeks how to say this. I wrote it down. I threw it away. I wrote it again. I'm just going to say it. At this point, the room was still assuming this was a toast. A little awkward in the opening, maybe, but that happens sometimes. People got nervous in front of crowds. I was smiling at him from the sweetheart table. Daniel had his hand over mine. Victor said, I have loved Allie since the moment I knew she existed. I want everyone in this room to know that. What I'm about to say does not change that. It has not changed that for me. Not for a single second. That was when I felt Daniel's hand tighten over mine. Not because of what Victor said, because of the way he said it. There was a specific kind of weight in his voice, the weight of something that has been held for a long time and is finally being set down. I recognized it without being able to name it. My stomach dropped the way it drops in an elevator that moves faster than expected. Victor said, "2 weeks ago, I found out that Allie is not my biological daughter." I will not try to describe what happened inside me in that moment because I don't think language is adequate for it. It was not a thought. It was not even really a feeling. It was something more physical than that, a kind of internal lurch, like the floor had simply ceased to exist beneath my chair, and I was briefly, completely weightless. I heard the room react before I fully processed what I had heard. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere to my left. Someone said, "Oh my God," in a low voice near the back. A chair scraped. And then, cutting through all of it, the sound of heels on hardwood, fast and purposeful, moving toward the exit. I turned. My mother had already pushed back from her table. She was walking toward the side door with her clutch pressed against her chest and her eyes straight ahead, the way a person walks when they are trying to look composed and are failing completely. I looked back at Victor. He was still standing at the microphone. He had not looked away from me once. Not when the room reacted. Not when my mother left. His eyes were on me, and they were steady. And they were full of something I had seen in them my whole life, but never had a word for until that moment. Grief and love at the same time. Fully, simultaneously, without one canceling out the other. He said, "I am telling you this because you deserve the truth. Because you are starting a marriage today, and you deserve to start it standing on solid ground. And because the man who is your biological father is out there somewhere, and that is something you have the right to know." He paused. He picked up the note card and looked at it once and put it back down. He said, "I would do all 20 years again, every single one, without changing a thing. You were never a mistake to me, Allie. You were the whole point." Then he set the microphone back in the stand, straightened his jacket, and sat down. The room did not applaud. It was too stunned for applause. It sat in the kind of silence that follows something true. The silence that means everyone in the room is doing the same thing at the same time, which is trying to figure out how to breathe normally again. Daniel was looking at me. I could feel him looking at me. I could not look back at him yet because I was still looking at Victor, who was now sitting with his hands flat on the table and his eyes down, the way a man sits when he has just done the hardest thing he has ever done and is waiting to find out if it was the right call. I stood up. I walked across the room to where he was sitting. I didn't say anything yet. I just put my hand on his shoulder and stood next to him for a moment. Then, I went to find my mother. If you have ever been in a room when the truth finally surfaced after years of being buried, type "the room went silent" in the comments. And keep listening, because what happened in that hallway with my mother is the part of this story I almost didn't have the courage to tell. The side hallway of the venue was all white walls and recessed lighting, and the kind of carpet that costs more than it looks. There was a love seat near the window at the far end, decorative, probably never sat in, and a tall vase of white flowers on a narrow table. It was the kind of space designed to look elegant and feel like nothing. My mother was standing at the window with her back to me when I came through the door. She heard my footsteps, but didn't turn around. She was looking out at the parking lot. The October light was falling at a low angle, and it caught the side of her face, and I could see she had been crying. Not the composed, dabbing at the corner of the eye kind of crying. The real kind. The kind that undoes your mascara and tightens your throat and makes you look 10 years older and somehow also younger at the same time. Because grief strips away the careful presentation we spend our whole lives building. I said, "Mom?" She turned around. She opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at me the way people look at someone they have wronged, when the wronged person is standing directly in front of them and there is no exit and no more time. I said, "Tell me." And she did. She spoke for about 20 minutes. Her voice broke 4 times. She stopped twice and pressed her fingers against her lips and looked at the ceiling, the way you do when you are trying to hold something back that is going to come out anyway. I stood across from her with my arms folded, not in anger, though there was anger, but because I needed something to hold on to, and that was the only thing available. Here is what she told me. When she was 28 years old, 2 years into her marriage to Victor, she met someone. She said it as plainly as that. She met someone. A man she worked with briefly on a joint project between departments. It was not a long affair. It was, by her account, 3 months. She said she had been lonely in ways she did not fully understand at the time, that she and Victor were fundamentally mismatched in ways that the early excitement of marriage had papered over, and by year 2, the paper was peeling, and she did not know how to talk to him about it, and instead, she made a different and catastrophic choice. The other man's name was Robert Callahan. He was 34, married with a young son. The affair ended when Sandra realized she was pregnant and told him. His response was immediate and unambiguous. He said it was not his problem. He said if she pursued it, he would deny everything. He said she needed to handle it. She said the word handle with a specific bitterness. 12 syllables worth of bitterness compressed into 2. The way only someone who has replayed a conversation for 30 years can deliver a word. She was 8 weeks pregnant, and terrified, and alone. She and Victor were still legally married. The timing was close enough, technically barely possible, that she could tell him the child was his. And so she did. She said she told herself it would be fine. She said she told herself that Victor was a good man and would be a good father, and the child would be loved, and maybe the biological details simply did not matter as much as everyone pretended they did. She said she told herself this for 30 years. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, she stood very still, like someone waiting for a verdict. Her mascara was completely gone. Her hands were shaking slightly at her sides. I said, "Did you ever think about telling him?" She looked at the floor. She said yes. She said there were at least a dozen moments over the years, moments when she almost told him. Early in the divorce proceedings, when the guilt was loudest, when I was 13 and got sick and needed blood work, and she was terrified for 3 days that something would surface in the lab results. The morning of my high school graduation, watching Victor sit in the bleachers in the rain because there were no seats left under the canopy, and he refused to miss the ceremony. She said she would get to the edge of saying it, and then she would think about what it would cost. Not herself, but him. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself the truth would only cause damage. She told herself I was his daughter in every way that mattered. She was right about the last part. She was wrong about the rest. I did not tell her I forgave her in that hallway. I was not ready to say that yet, and I was not going to say it before I meant it. What I said was that I heard her, that I understood more than she probably expected me to, and that we were not done talking about this, not by a long way, but that today was not the day to have the rest of that conversation. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Completely unguarded. No presentation left. Just a 60-year-old woman standing in a hallway with the full weight of a 30-year secret finally off her chest. And no idea yet if that made her lighter or just emptier. I asked her one more thing before I went back inside. I asked her Robert Callahan's name. She had already said it, but I wanted to hear it again, clearly, so there was no question I had heard correctly. She said it again. Robert Callahan. I repeated it quietly to myself, the way you repeat something you need to remember. Then I went back through the door into the light and the flowers and the 120 people sitting in stunned silence, waiting to find out what happened next. I want to ask you something directly. If you found out tomorrow that the person who raised you, who showed up, who paid the bills, who drove you to school and sat in the rain at your graduation, was not your biological parent, what would that change? Would it change how you felt about them? Would it change who they are to you? I am not asking rhetorically. I sat with this question for weeks after the wedding, and I still do not have a clean answer. What I have is a more complicated one, which I think might actually be closer to the truth. I searched Robert Callahan's name in the parking lot of the venue on my wedding day, still in my dress, standing next to a decorative topiary with my phone in both hands. Daniel was inside. He had given me 5 minutes, which was the right call, because 5 minutes was what I needed. It took about 40 seconds to find him. He was not hard to locate. There are not that many Robert Callahans in this city, and only one of them had a LinkedIn profile that listed the right employer history and age range. He had a profile picture. He looked like a person, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of face you would walk past 1,000 times. He was 62 now. He had a consulting company. His profile listed his wife of 30 years and mentioned, in the About section, that he was proud father of 2 sons. 2 sons. No daughters. As far as he knew. I stared at his picture for a long time. I tried to feel something recognizable, some flicker of connection, some biological pull that the movies always suggest should be there. I felt nothing. He was a stranger with a familiar nose, maybe. Or maybe I was imagining even that. I put my phone in my clutch and stood there for another minute. Here is what I kept coming back to. Robert Callahan had made a choice 30 years ago. He had looked at a pregnant woman and said it was not his problem and walked away. That was the full extent of his involvement in my life. A door closed before it was ever opened. Victor had made a different choice. Victor had shown up every Saturday for 20 years. He had driven 45 minutes in a snowstorm for a swim meet. He had stood in the rain at my graduation. He had bought a navy suit for my wedding. He had stood up in front of 120 people and told the truth at enormous personal cost, because he believed I deserved to start my marriage on solid ground. Biology is a fact. Love is a choice. And I knew, standing in that parking lot in my wedding dress, which one had shaped me. But I also knew that the question of Robert Callahan was not one I could close the door on entirely. Not yet. There might be medical reasons I would need to know his history. There might come a day, if Daniel and I had children, when certain questions mattered in ways I could not currently predict. The information was out there. It existed. Pretending it didn't felt like making my mother's mistake in a smaller key. I decided I was not ready to contact him. Not that day, not that month. But I was not going to pretend I didn't know his name. I put my phone away and called Victor. He picked up on the second ring. I could tell from the acoustics that he was outside. I could hear wind and, faintly, the sound of other cars. I said, "Where are you?" He said, "Parking garage, level 2. I said, "Don't move." I found the stairwell and took it up 2 flights, still in my heels and my dress and the small pearl earrings I had bought specifically for this day. The parking garage smelled like concrete and exhaust and the specific cold of enclosed spaces. I walked along the row of cars and found his gray Toyota, still the same model, still somehow the same car, in a spot near the wall. The engine was off. He was sitting in the driver's seat in the dark. I knocked on the passenger window. He looked over. He unlocked the door. I got in. The parking garage was quiet in the way that large enclosed concrete spaces are quiet. Not silent, but muffled. The sounds of the city reduced to a hum that came from everywhere and nowhere. Somewhere above us, through the ceiling, through 2 floors of a building, our wedding reception was still technically in progress. I could not hear it. I was not thinking about it. I sat in the passenger seat of Victor's gray Toyota and looked at my hands in my lap for a moment. My bouquet was still in the car. I must have grabbed it on the way out without realizing. White roses and eucalyptus. I set it on the dashboard. Victor was looking straight ahead through the windshield. His jaw was set. His hands were on his knees. He was holding himself very still, in the particular way of a person who is afraid that if they move at all, something they are holding together will come apart. I said, "You should have told me." He said, "I know." I said, "Not today. Years ago. You should have told me when you started to suspect." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't suspect. I chose not to suspect. That's different. And it was the wrong choice. I know that now." I turned to look at him. His profile in the dim light of the parking garage, the shape of his nose, the line of his jaw, the gray at his temples that had been coming in since his early 50s. I had looked at this face my entire life. I had taken it completely for granted, in the way you take for granted the things that have always simply been there. I said, "Why today? Why stand up and say it today, in front of everyone?" He turned to look at me then. And this is the part I want you to hear clearly, because this is the part that I have thought about more than any other part of this entire story. He said, "Because you were about to start a marriage. And I know what it costs to build something on a foundation that isn't solid. I spent 20 years doing it. Not because I loved you any less, but because I was handed a story, and I chose to believe it without asking the right questions. I didn't want that for you. I didn't want you to be 50 years old and find out something that would rewrite your whole history. I wanted you to know now, while you can still choose what to do with it." I looked at him for a long time. The white roses on the dashboard reflected a small amount of light from somewhere. A distant fluorescent, maybe, or the faint glow coming in from the entrance ramp. Then I reached over and took his hand. His hand is large. It has always been large. The hand that caught me when I fell off the bicycle in the church parking lot. The hand that held the towel at the edge of the swim meet pool. The hand that shook Daniel's hand at Thanksgiving last year with the straightforward warmth of a man who is simply glad his daughter found someone good. I said, "You are my dad. That is not a biology question. That is not something a lab result gets to answer. You are my dad, and that is not going to change." He made a sound that I cannot fully describe. It was not quite a word and not quite a sob. It was the sound of 20 years of tension leaving a person's body all at once. He pressed his other hand over mine, and he lowered his head, and his shoulders shook twice, and then he was crying. Quietly. The way men cry when they have held it for a very long time, and the container finally reaches its limit. I did not try to stop him. I did not say, "It's okay," or "Don't cry," or any of the other things we say to people when we are actually saying, "Please stop making me feel the weight of this." I just held his hand and let him cry, and looked at the white roses on the dashboard, and thought about the church parking lot, and the blueberry pancakes, and the 45-minute drive in a snowstorm. After a while, he straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He let out a long, slow breath. He said, "I would do it again. All of it." I said, "I know you would. That's the whole point." We sat in the car for another 20 minutes after that, talking about smaller things. About Daniel, who Victor had always liked and had told me so unprompted when I first introduced them. About Victor's retirement, which was coming up in 2 years. About whether I was going to contact Robert Callahan, and whether there was any rush, and what I thought I actually wanted from that if I did. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was the most honest answer I could give, and that I should take whatever time I needed. Before we got out of the car, I asked him one more question. I asked if he was angry. At Sandra, at the situation. At 20 years of child support paid for a child that biologically belonged to someone else. He thought about it genuinely, the way he thinks about everything, slowly, without rushing the answer. He said, "I was angry for about 4 days after I found out. Then I realized the anger was sitting on top of something else. Underneath it, I was just sad. For the version of things that didn't happen. For the conversations we never got to have. For the fact that your mother carried this for 30 years. And I think it cost her things I'll never fully understand." He paused. He said, "And then, underneath that, there was just the 20 years. And the 20 years were real. So I decided to stay there, in the real part." I stayed in the real part with him, in that car, in that parking garage, for a little while longer. Then we went back upstairs. The wedding happened the next day. Not the reception. Not the 120 guests and the live band and the carefully curated playlist and the centerpieces we had spent 3 weeks deciding on. That version of the day was over. What happened instead was smaller and quieter, and, I have come to believe, more genuinely ours. Daniel and I drove to the county courthouse on a Sunday morning. We brought 4 people: my mother, Victor, Daniel's parents. The courthouse was open for a few hours on Sundays for exactly this kind of thing. No appointment needed, a justice of the peace, a small room with fluorescent lighting, and a wall plaque and a window that looked out onto the street where pigeons were arguing over a pretzel. It took 11 minutes. We signed the license. We said the vows. Daniel cried again. Same shoulder shaking as the day before. Same best man adjacent back pat. Except this time, it was Victor who put a hand on his shoulder. And then Victor walked me out of the building into the October light. Not down an aisle with 120 people watching. Just out through a set of glass doors onto a sidewalk where a pigeon was still working on the pretzel. But he was beside me. And that, it turned out, was the only part that had ever actually mattered. The months that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because stories like this can sometimes flatten out at the end into a clean resolution that real life does not actually provide. What real life provided was messier and slower and occasionally harder, and also, eventually, better. My relationship with Sandra did not recover quickly. We spoke on the phone about 2 weeks after the wedding, a conversation that lasted almost 2 hours and covered a lot of ground and resolved very little, except that we both agreed we were not willing to stop trying. She started seeing a therapist in November. I think that was the first genuinely courageous thing I had seen her do in years, and I told her so. We have dinner together about once a month now. Sometimes it is easy, sometimes it is not. There are still things I need her to say that she has not said yet, and there are still things she needs from me that I am not fully ready to give. But we show up. We sit across from each other, and we eat, and we talk about ordinary things, and occasionally we talk about the hard things. It is slow. It is real. I called Robert Callahan in February, 4 months after the wedding. I will not describe that conversation in detail because parts of it belong only to me. What I will tell you is that he answered the phone, that he was quiet for a long time after I said my name and explained who I was, that he did not deny it, that he said he had thought about the possibility over the years in a vague and avoidable way, and had always found reasons not to pursue it. We met for coffee once. It lasted about an hour. He was polite. He was uncomfortable. He was not a villain. He was just a man who had made a bad choice at 34 and had spent 30 years not thinking too hard about the consequences. I do not hate him. I also do not feel any particular warmth toward him. He is, at this point, a fact about my biology and a data point in my medical history. I told him I might reach out again if medical questions came up. He said, of course. We shook hands outside the coffee shop and went in opposite directions. On the drive home, I called Victor and told him how it went. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Are you okay?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Want blueberry pancakes?" I laughed for the first time in what felt like a week. We went to the diner on 5th Street, the same one from my childhood. The same waitress, older now, same apron, who still remembered his order. We sat across from each other at a table by the window and ate blueberry pancakes and drank bad coffee and talked about his upcoming retirement and Daniel's new job and whether we should get a dog and what we thought about the city's new highway project and whether the engineering was as questionable as it looked from the outside. It was the most ordinary morning I had ever had. It was also one of the best. Here is what I want to leave you with. The truth cost something. It cost a version of my wedding day that I had imagined since I was 8 years old. It cost a period of relative peace with my mother that I am only now slowly rebuilding. It cost Victor a level of privacy he probably would have preferred to keep. It cost Daniel 2 weeks of carrying a secret that was not his to carry, and that he handled, by the way, with a grace I will never fully be able to repay. But here is what the truth gave back. It gave me the actual floor. The real one. The one that holds your weight, not because you are pretending it will, but because it genuinely can. I know who I am now. Not perfectly, not with every question answered, but more completely than I did before. I know that my father is a man named Victor, who drove 45 minutes in a snowstorm for a swim meet and stood up in front of 120 people on the hardest day of his life because he believed I deserved to start my marriage standing on solid ground. I know that real fatherhood is not a result on a lab report. It is 20 years of Saturday mornings and blueberry pancakes and a towel at the edge of a pool and a hand that catches you when you fall off the bicycle and celebrates the 30 feet before you even hit the ground. It is the choice, made over and over, to show up. Victor made that choice for 20 years without knowing what he was really choosing. He chose it anyway. He kept choosing it. And then, when the truth arrived, he made one more choice, the most expensive one, and told it. That is who my father is. That is the whole point. If this story reached something in you, if you have a person in your life who chose to show up for you in ways that went beyond obligation, tell them. Today, if you can. Not tomorrow. Today. And if you are the person who has been showing up, who has been driving the 45 minutes and standing in the rain and sending the checks and sitting in the parking garage in the dark, I want you to know something. It mattered. Every single time. It mattered more than you know. Type "it mattered" in the comments if you felt that. And share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.